Hello, welcome to our second lecture. In this unit, we're talking about language acquisition, first, second, and written. For most of my talk today, I'm going to be talking about second language acquisition. I think that's the most relevant to the course materials over the course of the semester. It is important to begin with some discussion of first language acquisition. What do you think are some of the key differences between first and second language acquisition? And this can just be a matter of brainstorming, thinking about how much time we allow from the time a baby is immersed into a language community before we expect meaningful sentence level production from that child. What is the amount of input that is given for first language acquisition without any expectation of response? What then is the role of learning in second language acquisition? The textbook, the Freeman and Freeman text, really does get very deeply into the difference between learning and acquisition, and that's something to pay a great deal of attention to. Another question that I have about the difference between first and second language acquisition is the role of errors. How are children's errors usually handled? How are adult errors usually handled? And how are errors handled within children who are learning or acquiring, depending on which theoretical position you're taking, a first language versus a second language? These are just questions that I think if you think through them just commonsensically, you'll come up with some answers and some ideas. The textbook does a really wonderful job talking about written language. One of the things that I want to highlight when we're talking about written language or language acquisition in general is the 4 different language skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. We see in this chapter especially, or these chapters especially, we see different trajectories for the acquisition of those different skills. And that is definitely something to pay attention to as we're working through all of the units of this course, and certainly the difference between second language verbal acquisition and second language written acquisition. There's different perspectives of second language acquisition, and some of this you will have seen in your text. The first is the behaviorist perspective, and that was really how theorists thought that languages were acquired for many years, and that came out of Skinner and that whole notion of mimicry and memorization. Maybe some of you can think about your excuse me, speaker, I'm trying to make a video. Just say hi. Okay. You need to talk to Daddy. Okay. Excuse me. We looked at Skinner. When you were filling out some of your language acquisition experiences or language learning experiences, were any of those that you think teaching styles that came out of behaviorism? Was there any work on that was mimicry, memorizing, any work on memorizing things that you were just decontextualized, not meaning-based? Just how to remember. How did you enjoy that experience? How effective was that experience? The next way of looking at language acquisition, language development, is the innatist perspective. And that really did come from Chomsky and his notions of the universal grammar, starting in the 1950s. Krashen really did pick up a lot of Chomsky's research and Chomsky's work when he made his monitor hypothesis and his comprehensive input hypothesis there in Krashen's work, and that is certainly something to be emphasized. I'm not going to talk about Krashen too much in this because I know the book handles it very nicely, and I know that many of you who've had classes with Dr. Wink have had excellent exposure to that, and I certainly couldn't do it justice. after following what you've had with her, nor should I try. We can look at some other theories now. Another way of looking at it, some more of the common or more contemporary calls crash and into question, takes more of a cognitive perspective that focuses on learning, where the UG and the monitor perspective would be certainly much more of an acquisition perspective. Cognitive perspectives of second language acquisition really are taking a learning standpoint to it. And they liken the brain to a computer processor, or they do neurological research to see what's happening. The Patricia Cole article, even though that is first language acquisition, that takes a very cognitive perspective of what happens in the neural network, neurobiologically, with language acquisition. And for second language acquisition, what researchers do is they look at then the differences between the first and the second language process, and how learning kind of interferes with the innatist, the tacit acquisition that happens in children. Another perspective to look at is the socio-cultural perspective. And this one focuses on meaningful use of language in a community. When we are in the text, Heath's study is a really good example of language acquisition, whether it's first or second language acquisition, but language acquisition perspective from a socio-cultural background. It also, if any of you who have done work, so if you haven't read that yet, I'd recommend that you read it. Also, I know that a lot of the work out of education, and certainly when I was going through my teacher training, has a lot of talk about scaffolding, Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development. These are all discussions that come out of a sociocultural tradition that looks at the language development process, and that applies to both first and second language acquisition. How it happens differently in second language acquisition is an interesting discussion to have, but it is something that we do need to account for. What I'm going to present you with today and talk about is what's called the dynamic system theory. I did put up an article, a very nice, concise treatment of dynamic systems theory. I have a whole book on it, but dynamic systems theory for language acquisition. What I like about the dynamic system theory approach is that it really pulls from the best of all of the others. It pulls from the best of the innatist perspective. It pulls from the best of the cognitive perspective. It pulls from the best of the sociocultural perspective, and how they can kind of work together in complex ways to address some of the weaknesses or some of the questions that the other perspectives might raise. So, to me, dynamic systems theory just seems to make a whole lot of sense, where it says we don't have to choose necessarily between one of them. With the exception of behaviorism, I don't know, I haven't read any research, recent at least, that takes any kind of a behaviorist perspective on that. The dynamic system theory certainly would bring in elements of the innatist perspective, and the UG, and the article addresses how it does that. And the cognitive perspective, it talks about that as well when it's talking about the external resources. And the sociocultural perspective comes in. So I kind of like that because it just is more comprehensive in nature. To get into it a little bit more depth, the dynamic systems theory, it actually came out of mathematics. And it shows how simple systems, simple mathematical equations become increasingly complex in their in interaction with each other. This complexity exponentially increases when we're talking about systems which are complex to begin with, and they have many interacting parts to begin with, and then you start looking at all of the different ways that they can interact. Our complexity levels increase dramatically. Important components of the dynamic systems theory. In a dynamic system, you have complete interconnectedness. All components affect every other component. When one changes, everything else is changed. And then because it's dynamic, they're all constantly changing and they're all constantly affecting each other. And so you're in this state of constant flux and constant mobility and movement. And that's something to really remember when we're talking about second language acquisition is that the brain is constantly, of the learner, is constantly acquiring, is constantly absorbing, is constantly learning as well as going through the acquisition process. And so that is what is happening in my perspective, and certainly in the perspective of those theorists who have proposed it. And another interesting component that I want to bring out for the DST is that you're talking about unpredictable outcomes. It's not necessarily a formula. You can't say if you give any child X, Y, and Z, they are going to have this outcome of your mastery of their second language or their new language in 6 months, or however you wanted to say. It takes into account many different components, like different native languages, different first languages are going to affect the acquisition of English. We talked about something like written acquisition. If you're coming from with a student that has some kind of literacy skills in another alphabetic language, then they'll have the alphabetic skills for English, where if they do have written language development because they're old enough, but it was in a pictorial language, then their acquisition of the English alphabetic system will look very different, right? And so even something, a component as seemingly simple as the which first language, which native language a student has, is going to affect throw kind of everything else in the system into a different trajectory. Something to think about. When we're looking at dynamic systems theory for second language acquisitions, I want us to, specifically for second language acquisition, I want us to think about our students or our learners as possessing a cognitive ecosystem. And think of any other ecosystem. You're talking about, again, just like any system, many interworking parts that are constantly changing, that are constantly interacting with each other and constantly affecting each other. And you're thinking about the relationship of the learner and the environment in which that learner is situated. So it's not all just innate internal to the learner that we're working with. The text that I put up for you to read distinguishes between internal and external resources. I really question whether resources is the correct word. I had thought maybe components would have been a better word. But in the end, I decided that I agreed with the authors that I liked the notion of resources, thinking about what some of the different internal resources that a person might come into when it's time, or when they're approaching the process of learning or acquiring or learning, however, a second language. Motivation is going to be a resource or a component. Certainly, level of cognitive development is going to be a component. Attitude, getting into some of that Krashen's effective filter is going to be a component. Memory. People that have a better memory are better able to remember new vocabulary words, right, that they're studying for a new language, and things like that. So those are all going to be factors that are internal to the individual. External resources, can be a number of things. Certainly what's happening in the instruction is an external resource that's happening in the home. A child that is exposed to written language, whether it's being read to them or able to read themselves, is going to have a different level of external resources than someone that is not being exposed to written language. But if they're not being exposed to written language, then there are various types of literacy, and oral literacy is certainly one of them. And so is there a tradition of oral storytelling? That would be then an external resource, and it would look maybe slightly different from those that had not oral storytelling, but oral reading in the home, and that would just affect the whole system. It's important for teachers to be aware of some of these things and know that that's going to affect what the child brings in, and that's going to affect how we instruct this individual. And so I think that thinking through what are some of the internal resources and what are some of the external resources, and then how can we identify where the students fall for that, how many of these resources do they have access to, and what do they look like for this child or this learner, whatever age they are. Another thing to think about is the variability. There are hugely complex, and I feel like I'm just hitting this nail to death, but the interactions between the internal and external variables are always changing, but that changing is going to be comprising a complete unit, and so we need to be looking at that unit as something that is all encompassing. So what this does is it tells us that we have to move away, I think with a dynamic system theory approach, what we have to do is we have to move away from, and this is where I want to just kind of add a little bit more to what the book is saying, move away from learning versus acquisition to seeing an approach to second language acquisition. So there is an element of learning involved. There is learning and acquisition are happening in conjunction with one another. And that's certainly something that we need to be remembering as we're working with our students. In application, what I want to say is, how does this change anything? How does this affect your teaching? Know your students. Get information on those internal and external resources. That's why I have a language profile on the module today for this week. I'm going to push it off. I don't think that we're ready to be going through that, but this at least starts to explore the reasons for having some kind of a language and learning profile on each student that you have that is a language student. And whether it's formally or informally completed, you have to figure out what kind of resources you have and what abilities you have to do that. But know the students. Get information. You're not going to be able to as effectively meet those students' needs without that. Secondly, know your question. The comprehensible input, the monitor, the effective filter, all of those elements of the input hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, are really vital, and they're for both. Some of them are external, some of them are internal, but they're really vital. And this does not, everything that we're talking about does not negate that. What it does is it helps us to put some of that into practice. Also, the dynamic systems theory, when we're taking that into thought and into consideration, it means that we pay a lot of attention to the non-standard language productions. And looking at that would typically be called errors. I don't like to call them errors because from a language acquisition process, then that tells me a whole lot about what's going on in the dynamic system of language acquisition in that particular learner. So when I can listen to the errors and kind of errors, when I can listen to those non-standard productions or read if I'm looking at written language and read those non-standard productions, then it helps me to get a really good roadmap to what's happening in that language development process. And that's vitally important to know where to move next. Because that's our job as teachers, right? We identify what's happening with this learner and what can we do to get this learner moving forward into new levels of success. The next key term and key idea that I really wanted to bring up is the notion of negotiating of meaning. Students, and this really does come back to my background with Halliday, is meaning has to come first. That, back to Crash and that comprehensible input. If the language is not meaningful, it will not be understood. It will not be acquired. But it's the students it is the learner, it is the acquirer who is going through that process of negotiating meaning for themselves. We do whatever we can to help it and to assist it, but that the language, whether we're taking a learning or an acquisition approach or some kind of an interaction between the two, that process happens as they are negotiating meaning with the language structures and with the language within the language structures, within the language forms, and that's where the learning takes place, and the acquisition. So supporting students through the process of negotiating meaning. And this, they can be negotiating meaning with the material that they're reading or the material that they're being exposed to, listening to, but also the negotiating meaning with each other in conversation is a very vital part of the language development process. Whether they are, and we could get into it, we really don't have time in this module, but whether they are negotiating meaning with another peer who is at their, at similar, it will never be exactly, but at similar levels of language development, or someone who has a slightly higher level of language development or slightly lower level of language development. There are different theories and different ideas about which of those situations is ideal. I say there's strengths and weaknesses to both. The greatest thing to have there is variety, and where students are working together as learners to negotiate meaning, very, very vital. That is where language acquisition gets really exciting for students. And all of a sudden, things that used to be foreign to them, they're able to communicate and they're able to receive messages that they were never able to receive before. And then they find that they know stuff they didn't even realize they had known. Acquisition is a very powerful force. Noticing is the last one that I have here as far as an application of dynamic systems theory. I really find the noticing hypothesis to be valuable and powerful in myself as a language learner, in addition to myself as a language teacher. But the way that I use the noticing hypothesis is kind of different. I like to say that there's a strong form of the noticing hypothesis and a weak form. A lot of times if you were to Google it and read it yourself, what would be presented would be the strong form. And I have big problems with noticing in its strong form. The strong form says that noticing is necessary for the acquisition of a structure or a word or language. And I think it's blatantly wrong. I mean, my own experience negates it. There's plenty of literature that negates it, that it's perfectly acceptable even with adults who have well-developed first language systems, who are learning their second languages, with appropriate levels of input and appropriate levels of comprehensible input and rich language experiences to acquire structures or words that they didn't even know they knew. I've seen it happen with my students over and over again. I've certainly seen it happen with myself over and over again. So I really don't buy the strong form of the noticing hypothesis, but I do really think that there's something significantly important in what I call the weak form of the noticing hypothesis. And that is that if we teach a word or we introduce a student to a word or a construction, it's not with the expectation that they're going to be able to use it and produce it right away, right? Like, that's what people say. You don't ever teach grammar because students aren't going to be able to use it. They'll continue. And I say, no, right. You don't do it so that they start using that structure correctly, appropriately in the future. What you do is you teach a structure, if it's the correct structure, right? If it's in that I+1 range, as Krashen would say. If it's an appropriate structure, it's a little bit outside their comfort zone, what they would be able to do on their own. They might not be producing it, but they'll start to recognize it around. They'll start to recognize it in some of those other rich language experiences that they have. And when they start to see it, and they can kind of connect it to that previous learning, because we know that learning happens organically. We know that learning happens when you're connecting new learning to old learning. So when that structure or that word becomes their old learning and then they see it in an authentic experience or an authentic in their environment, then all of a sudden it has something to hold on to, and then all of a sudden they get it, they understand it, and they get closer and closer to being able to produce it. It'll still, their production is likely to be growing and developing, but not completely standard, but that's okay, right? That's the process. So I think noticing is an important thing to think about. We want to increase the noticing in the students, and so then that they can have some of those discovery moments. You know, it's kind of like setting the seeds for the discovery moments to happen. So I like the weak form of noticing. I don't necessarily buy the strong form of it. But I wanted to talk about it here because I didn't see it in the text. And we read the Wong, Fillmore, and Snow article, and they talk about the importance of teachers having a grammar background and having a strong linguistic background. There's a reason for that. I mean, we can set up experiences and linguistic experiences for our students so that we can better choose what are the structures that are appropriate in this learner at this time, and do that. And that's where noticing comes in. It's just kind of bring last week and this week together as far as the Wong, Fillmore, Snow article. Concluding remarks on this lecture. One of the things that I didn't see, another thing that I didn't see in the text that's important, is that there's always a silent period of second language acquisition. Many of you can reflect on whatever level of second language acquisition you had. You can reflect on when you first started. Could you carry on a conversation? Could you talk? If you never really got out of the silent period, because of the types of experiences you had with your second language learning, then you know that I wasn't able to do anything other than rotely repeat what was provided to me. And that's completely natural. Learners, when they come into a new language, all have a silent period, very similar to babies have a silent period before we expect them to speak. So we can't, if you have one of those learners that's new to English and they're not producing yet, I mean, they're not talking yet, they're not writing yet, you think that based on some of their written work, and they can identify, and they can follow instructions, and you can tell that they understand what you're saying, but you're like, it's been 6 months, what's going on? That's okay. That's part of the language acquisition process. They're in their silent period, and this is a very well-defined stage of language acquisition. Important things that I want you to get from the text. Page 14 in Chapter 1 and page 22 in Chapter 2 refer to Garcia, 2009, and her work on language as an action, not a subject. This is a huge component of this class, and it's kind of mentioned in passing. You might have missed it, you might have just seen it, but it's not really highlighted. I wanted to spend some time highlighting it here because for Garcia, she sees language as something that we do. We are languaging right now, whether it's receptive language or productive language. Languaging is what's happening. You're hearing my daughter behind me. She is playing and she is talking to herself as she's working and playing. She is languaging as her language is developing. So we have languaging, we have translanguaging. That's kind of what's the difference between the two of them. We're going to get to that in future modules, but I wanted to bring that out and see how, because it was really interesting to me that they mentioned it in Chapter 1, they mentioned it in Chapter 2, and it shows just how cohesive some of the theoretical work that we do here, and then some of the practical work that you're doing when you're doing your translanguaging journals really is going to be. As I talk about those, I do want to say, if you are not in the classroom right now teaching, or if you are teaching in a setting where you don't have any students who are non-native English speakers, contact me. I'm hoping that we have 3 or 4 of you But if it's just only one or two, I need to know. I do have some ideas of how to present or some other alternative ways of fulfilling that part of the course requirements that I think will be just as meaningful, if not more meaningful, as working with the students yourself. So I just want to get a better feel at how many before I figure out how to handle that. Secondly, there are two exercises that are up in this module. The first one is I want you to start to brainstorm and kind of collaboratively come up with a big list of what are some of those internal and external resources that comprise a dynamic system. And you don't need to really even expound on these, just kind of list them out. If I wish that I had in D2L the capability of having like one Google Docs and you could just go in and add to it, and add to it, and add to it, and add to it. You know, I don't want to be on several different platforms. That just seems frustrating to me. So all we have are those discussion boards, and so whatever, that's what we're going to go with. So try to get some of those, get a list of resources, and when you see what others have, you don't have to retype what others have. Say all ditto and this, you know. One of the things we look at is maternal education level. That would certainly be an external resource, right? Just things like that. Everything is off the wall as you can get to. This is a brainstorming section. What are the internal and external resources that comprise the dynamic system of language acquisition for a learner or an acquirer? The last thing that I have up there is the WUG test exercise. The WUG test actually came out of I think it was the late 1950s, also early 1960s. Certainly came in the school in the tradition of the innatist perspective in Chomsky. And what she did when she was she started to actually document some of the process, this natural form of how language acquisition happens. First language acquisition innately happens in children. And she was actually using morphology, but we'll talk about that in a few weeks. But I have it's on the blog. I mean, and I could put up the seminal article that she wrote about it, but I just want you to have fun with it. I want you to see the blog article, see the WUG test, work through it yourself, see if you can fill in the blanks. If you have a young child, certainly I've done it with my children. I'll walk them through it, see how they do. It's a kind of a fun way of how linguists have made some of these theories that we've talked about. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for being a part of this course. And I hope to see you soon. Have a great week, and send me those questions that you have. Either send them to me through D2L or in the internet or through my email address. So it's great working with you.